So this week we're just going to kind of combine what we've been doing the last few weeks and review how we can solve quadratics, those things that have the x squareds in them. So the first method we learned was to solve by factoring. Okay, and any of our methods, factoring or quadratic formula, you have to get one side equal to 0. So if we started with the equation 4x minus 60 equals negative x squared, we want one side to equal 0. I'm going to move the x squared because that requires the least amount of work. Plus, when possible, I like my x squared to be positive. So I've got x squared plus 4x minus 60 equals 0. So now what we want to do is figure out what two numbers we need in our parentheses. So remember, we want to multiply to that last term, that constant. So I need something that's going to multiply to negative 60, keep its sign, and we want something that adds to the middle term, so something that will add to a positive 4. Now, knowing that we're multiplying to a negative, that tells us one of our numbers is going to be positive, one's going to be negative. Knowing when we add them gives us a positive tells us that our bigger of the two numbers has to be the positive. So 60, my instinct is to say 6 and 10. Well, we know one has to be negative, and this told us the positive has to be bigger. So that means negative 6 and positive 10. Okay, that works to our negative 60. Is a negative 6 plus 10 4? Yes, it is. So we know we found the correct one. If you don't find the correct one, you just keep trying different ways to get 60. We could have done 5 and 12. We could have done 30 and 2, or 20 and 3, or 15 and 4. There's different things. You just go until you find the one that works. But negative 6 and 10 works. So that means this is going to factor to an x minus 6 and an x plus 10 equals 0. So that's the factored form. That's not our final answer. To get our final answer, we break it up, and each one of these parentheses gets its own problem. X minus 6 equals 0, which means x equals 6, and x plus 10 equals 0. Subtract the 10, that tells us x is negative 10. So there are the two answers. And remember, when you're solving, you can always plug those back into the original, not the first step you did, but the original, and see if your answer is correct. So when you've got nothing in front of the x squared, and your one side is equal to 0, you can try factoring. Now, they won't all factor. So if you've made your list and you've tried a bunch of things and none of them work, then you aren't going to be able to factor. You're going to have to do quadratic formula. But if your x squared term has no number in front of it, I would try factoring first because it often works a little faster, especially if your brain works that way. Some people get very, very good at factoring. Now, our next case we have is the quadratic formula. Remember that x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So if we start with this problem, 3x squared plus 14x equals negative 8. So first step, once again, is to get one side equal to 0. So I'm going to move this 8 to the other side by adding it. So we have 3x squared plus 14x plus 8 equals 0. Now notice, there is a number in front of x squared. There are ways to factor those, you just haven't learned them yet. So for now, if you see something in front of the x squared, your brain should jump to quadratic formula. And put it up here just in case you've forgotten already. Negative b plus or minus square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So we need to identify our pieces. So in this problem, remember it goes a, b, c. A is always with your squared term, b is always with your x term, and c is always your constant. So once you have those pieces identified, now we plug them in. X equals negative 14 plus or minus the square root 14 squared minus 4 times 3 times 8. All of that over 2 times 3. Remember, square root goes over all of that stuff, and everything on top is over that 2a. Now we start to simplify. Negative 14 plus or minus square root. 14 squared is 196. 4 times 3 times 8 is 96. And 2 times 3 is 6. Okay, we keep going. Negative 14 plus or minus 196 minus 96 is 100 over 6. Now, you've worked with ones where this was a perfect square and ones where it's not. On your worksheet today, they're all going to be perfect squares. So there's one of your hints. So we get negative 14 plus or minus, well, the square root of 100 is 10 over 6. Now remember, we still get two answers. Once we've gotten rid of the square root, that is where you're going to break it into 2. So one of our answers is going to be where we do the negative 14 plus 10 over 6. And the other is where we do negative 14 minus 10 over 6. We do the positive version and the negative version. Well, this is going to give us negative 4 over 6, which simplifies to negative 2/3, or for the sake of today's worksheet, we will be putting them in decimals. So that is approximately negative 0.667. For the other one, we get negative 24 over 6, which works out nicely to negative 4. And remember, you've solved something, you know what x is, you can put those two answers in to this original and see what you got. Now for the decimal, if you're using your calculator, put in the decimal, it'll be really, really close. It may not be exactly, but within rounding it should be close. Or if you know what that decimal is as a fraction, work with the fraction. It's a little more work, you have to write it out, but then they will be exact. Now, one of the other things that you can do with quadratics, and this happens especially if you've got something that's multiple choice, something where you have to match answers to problems, you can go ahead and use that solving, checking skill to make things work better. So, checking your solutions. Regardless of what type of problem you're doing, if you are solving for x, check your answers. If you know you're right, that's awesome, okay? Especially on a quiz or test. Always check your answers if you have the time. So, it could also be written as a problem like this. So, which is a solution, or which are solutions to this problem? 5x squared minus 54x equals 2x minus 60. Okay, so we're going to check a couple different numbers and see which ones do and do not work. Now keep in mind, it's a quadratic. We might have two answers. It's also possible that it's a no real, so none of them would work. Or that if we did the quadratic formula, we'd have a 0 and there's only one thing that works. So we're just going to try a couple different ones. So let's start with x equals 1.2. It's a decimal. So get out your calculators if you haven't. We're going to plug 1.2 in everywhere we see x. So 5 times 1.2 squared minus 54 times 1.2 equals 2 times 1.2 minus 60. So, got my calculator here. What is 1.2 squared? Some of you might know this, 144. And then 144 times 5 is 7.2. So this entire thing becomes 7.2 minus 54 times 1.2 is 64.8. 2 times 1.2, that's going to be 2.4 minus 60. So now we just have to see 7.2 minus 64.8 is negative 57.6, and then 2.4 minus 60 is negative 57.6 as well. We plugged it in, both sides were the same. That is one of our solutions. Okay, let's check a couple others. I'm just going to change the spots where we're plugging in our numbers. So now let's try negative 1.2. So I'm going to put in a negative 1.2 for all of these. Okay, 5 times Well, first we gotta do our negative 1.2 squared, and keep in mind, when you square that negative, it's going to become a positive. So it's a positive 144, or 1.44, times 5, gets that 7.2 again. This time, since we're gonna have a negative times a negative, it's going to become a positive 64.8. Here we're gonna get a negative 2.4 and a negative 60. So looking at it right now, you might know, okay, that's not going to work because this side everything's positive, this side everything's negative. So you can keep going and prove that they're different, or just keep in mind, this is all positive, this is all negative. Obviously, they're not the same. So that one did not work. Okay, let's try something else. What if we check 0? So remember, 0 can be an answer. So if I plug in 0 here for all of these, well, that's going to become 0, that's going to become 0, that's going to become 0, minus 60. Are they the same? No, because we'll have 0 equals negative 60. So that one didn't work either. Okay, running out of space, let's just try one more. What if we try, let's do a whole number, 10. So if I plug in 10 here, positive 10 for all of these. Okay, 10 squared, that's 100, times 5 gives me 500. 54 times 10 is 540. 2 times 10 is 20, minus 60. So 500 minus 540, it's negative 40. 20 minus 60 is also negative 40. So there's our second answer. So if you have the option of kind of plugging in answers and seeing if they work, if you're given answers, this is what you can do. Just try them, see which ones work. Or solve them and see which ones match the answers that you are given. So you've got this worksheet today where you're going to solve individual problems. Once you figure out the answers to each, you cut out the little box that has the picture and you glue it onto the other one or tape it or whatever, and it will make a bigger picture overall. So each one is the little pieces that make up the whole, but you have to solve them all first.